Melbourne is the capital and most populous city in the Australian state of Victoria, and the second most populous city in Australia and Oceania. The name Melbourne refers to the area of urban agglomeration spanning 9,900 square kilometres which comprises the broader metropolitan area, as well as being the common name for its city centre. The metropolis is located on the large natural bay of Port Phillip and expands into the hinterlands toward the Dandenong and Macedon mountain ranges, Mornington Peninsula and Yarra Valley. Melbourne consists of 31 municipalities. It has a population of 4,442,918 as of 2014, and its inhabitants are called Melburnians. Founded by free settlers from the British Crown colony of Van Diemen's Land on 30 August 1835, in what was then the colony of New South Wales. It was incorporated as a Crown settlement in 1837. It was named Melbourne by the Governor of New South Wales, Sir Richard Burke, in honour of the British Prime Minister of the day, William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne. It was officially declared a city by Queen Victoria in 1847, after which it became the capital of the newly founded colony of Victoria in 1851. During the Victorian gold rush of the 1850s, it was transformed into one of the world's largest and wealthiest cities. After the Federation of Australia in 1901, it served as the nation's interim seat of government until 1927. Melbourne rates highly in education, entertainment, healthcare, research and development, tourism and sport, making it the world's most livable city, for the 5th year in a row in 2015, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit. It is a leading financial center in the Asia-Pacific region, and ranks among the top 30 cities in the world in the Global Financial Centers Index. Referred to as Australia's cultural capital, it is the birthplace of Australian Impressionism, Australian rules football, the Australian film and television industries, and Australian contemporary dance such as the Melbourne Shuffle. It is recognised as a UNESCO City of Literature and a major centre for street art, music and theatre. It is home to many of Australia's largest and oldest cultural institutions such as the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, Melbourne Cricket Ground, the National Gallery of Victoria, the State Library of Victoria and the UNESCO World Heritage listed Royal Exhibition Building. The 2016 edition of QS Best Student Cities ranked Melbourne the second best city in the world to be a university student. The main passenger airport serving the metropolis and the state is Melbourne Airport, which is the second busiest in Australia, and the Port of Melbourne is Australia's busiest seaport for containerised and general cargo. Melbourne has an extensive transport network. The main metropolitan train terminus is Flinders Street Station, and the main regional train and coach terminus is Southern Cross Station. Melbourne is also home to Australia's most extensive freeway network and has the world's largest urban tram network. History. Early history and foundation. Before the arrival of European settlers, the area was occupied for an estimated 31,000 to 40,000 years. At the time of European settlement, it was inhabited by under 20,000 hunter-gatherers from 3 indigenous regional tribes, the Wurundjeri, Boon Wurrung and Waithorong. The area was an important meeting place for the clans of the Kulin Nation Alliance and a vital source of food and water. The first European settlement in Victoria was established by Colonel David Collins in October 1803, at Sullivan Bay, near present-day Sorrento. But this settlement was relocated to what is now Hobart, Tasmania, in February 1804, due to a perceived lack of resources. It would be 30 years before another settlement was attempted. In May and June 1835, the area which is now central and northern Melbourne was explored by John Batman, a leading member of the Port Phillip Association in Van Diemen's Land, who claimed to have negotiated a purchase of 600,000 acres with 8 Wurundjeri elders. Batman selected a site on the northern bank of the Yarra River, declaring that this will be the place for a village. Batman then returned to Launceston in Tasmania. In early August 1835, a different group of settlers, including John Pascoe Faulkner, left Launceston on the ship Enterprise. Faulkner was forced to disembark at Georgetown, Tasmania, because of outstanding debts. The remainder of the party continued and arrived at the mouth of the Yarra River on 15 August 1835. On 30 August 1835 the party disembarked and established a settlement at the site of the current Melbourne Immigration Museum. Batman and his group arrived on 2 September 1835 and the two groups ultimately agreed to share the settlement. Batman's treaty with the Aborigines was annulled by the New South Wales governor, with compensation paid to members of the association. In 1836, Governor Burke declared the city the administrative capital of the Port Phillip district of New South Wales, and commissioned the first plan for the city, the Hoddle Grid, in 1837. The settlement was named Batmania after Batman. However, later that year the settlement was named Melbourne, after the British Prime Minister, William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne, whose seat was Melbourne Hall in the market town of Melbourne, Derbyshire. On 13 April 1837, the settlement's General Post Office was officially opened with that name. Between 1836 and 1842, Victorian Aboriginal groups were largely dispossessed of their land. By January 1844, there were said to be 675 Aborigines resident in squalid camps in Melbourne. The British Colonial Office appointed 5 Aboriginal protectors for the Aborigines of Victoria, in 1839. However, their work was nullified by a land policy that favoured squatters to take possession of Aboriginal lands. By 1845, fewer than 240 wealthy Europeans held all the pastoral licenses then issued in Victoria and became a powerful political and economic force in Victoria for generations to come. Melbourne was declared a city by letters patent of Queen Victoria, issued on 25 June 1847. On 1 July 1851, the Port Phillip district became the separate colony of Victoria, with Melbourne as its capital. Victorian Gold Rush. The discovery of gold in Victoria in mid-1851 led to the Victorian Gold Rush, and Melbourne, which served as the major port and provided most services for the region, experienced rapid growth. Within months, the city's population had increased by nearly three-quarters, from 25,000 to 40,000 inhabitants. Thereafter, growth was exponential and by 1865, Melbourne had overtaken Sydney as Australia's most populous city. Additionally, Melbourne, along with the Victorian regional cities of Ballarat and Geelong, became the wealthiest cities in the world during the Gold Rush era. An influx of interstate and overseas migrants, particularly Irish, German and Chinese, saw the development of slums, including a temporary tent city, established on the southern banks of the Yarra. Chinese migrants founded the Melbourne Chinatown in 1851, which remains the longest continuous Chinese settlement in the Western world. In the aftermath of the Eureka Stockade, mass public support for the plight of the miners resulted in major political changes to the colony, including changes to working conditions across local industries including mining, agriculture and manufacturing. The nationalities involved in the Eureka Revolt and Bourke and Wills expedition gave an indication of immigration flows in the second half of the 19th century, with the wealth brought on by the gold rush following closely on the heels of the establishment of Victoria as a separate colony and the subsequent need for public buildings. A program of grand civic construction soon began. The 1850s and 1860s saw the commencement of Parliament House, the Treasury Building, the Old Melbourne Jail, Victoria Barracks, the State Library, University, General Post Office, Customs House, the Melbourne Town Hall, St. Patrick's Cathedral, though many remained uncompleted for decades, with some still not finished. The layout of the inner suburbs on a largely one-mile grid pattern, cut through by wide radial boulevards, and string of gardens surrounding the central city was largely established in the 1850s and 1860s. These areas were rapidly filled from the mid-1850s by the ubiquitous terrace house, as well as detached houses and some ground mansions in large grounds, while some of the major roads developed as shopping streets. Melbourne quickly became a major finance centre, home to several banks, the Royal Mint, and Australia's first stock exchange in 1861. In 1855, the Melbourne Cricket Club secured possession of its now famous ground, the MCG. Members of the Melbourne Football Club codified Australian football in 1859, and Yarra rowing clubs and regattas became popular about the same time. In 1861, the Melbourne Cup was first run. In 1864, Melbourne acquired its first public monument, the Bourke and Wills statue. With the gold rush largely over by 1860, Melbourne continued to grow on the back of continuing gold mining. As the major port for exporting the agricultural products to Victoria, especially wool, and a developing manufacturing sector protected by high tariffs. An extensive radial railway network centred on Melbourne and spreading out across the suburbs and into the countryside was established from the late 1850s. Further major public buildings were begun in the 1860s and 1870s, such as the Supreme Court, Government House, and the Queen Victoria Market. The central city filled up with shops and offices, workshops, and warehouses. Large banks and hotels faced the main streets, with fine townhouses in the east end of Collins Street, contrasting with tiny cottages down landways within the blocks. The Aboriginal population continued to decline, with an estimated 80% total decrease by 1863, due primarily to introduced diseases, particularly smallpox, frontier violence and dispossession from their lands. Land boom and bust. The decade of the 1880s was one of extraordinary growth, when consumer confidence, easy access to credit, and steep increases in the price of land led to an enormous amount of construction. This land boom was followed by a severe economic crash in the early 1890s, which lasted until the end of the century. During the boom, Melbourne had reputedly become the richest city in the world, and the largest after London in the British Empire. The decade began with the Melbourne International Exhibition in 1880, held in the large purpose-built exhibition building. In 1880, a telephone exchange was established, and in the same year the foundations of St. Paul's were laid. In 1881, electric light was installed in the Eastern Market, and in the following year a generating station capable of supplying 2,000 incandescent lamps was in operation. In 1885, the first line of the Melbourne cable tramway system was built, becoming one of the world's most extensive systems by 1890. During a visit in 1885, English journalist George Augustus Henry Sala coined the phrase, "Marvellous Melbourne," which stuck long into the 20th century and is still used today by Melburnians. Growing building activity culminated in a land boom, which, in 1888, reached a peak of speculative development fueled by consumer confidence and escalating land value. As a result of the boom, large commercial buildings, coffee palaces, terrace housing and palatial mansions proliferated in the city. The establishment of a hydraulic facility in 1887 allowed for the local manufacture of elevators, resulting in the first construction of high-rise buildings, most notably the APA building, amongst the world's tallest commercial buildings upon completion in 1889. This period also saw the expansion of a major radial rail-based transport network. In 1888, the exhibition building hosted a second event even larger than the first, the Melbourne Centennial Exhibition, spurring construction of numerous hotels including the 500-room Federal Hotel, the Palace Hotel in Bourke Street, and the doubling in size of the Grand. A brash boosterism that had typified Melbourne during this time ended in the early 1890s with a severe depression of the city's economy. sending the local finance and property industries into a period of chaos during which 16 small land banks and building societies collapsed, and 133 limited companies went into liquidation. The Melbourne financial crisis was a contributing factor in the Australian economic depression of the 1890s and the Australian banking crisis of 1893. The effects of the depression on the city were profound, with virtually no new construction until the late 1890s. Federation of Australia. At the time of Australia's federation on 1 January 1901, Melbourne became the seat of government of the Federation. The first federal parliament was convened on 9 May 1901 in the Royal Exhibition Building, subsequently moving to the Victorian Parliament House where it was located until 1927, when it was moved to Canberra. The Governor-General of Australia resided at Government House in Melbourne until 1930, and many major national institutions remained in Melbourne well into the 20th century. Federation Square in Melbourne CBD was opened to mark the 100-year anniversary of Federation in Australia. Post-war period. In the immediate years after World War II, Melbourne expanded rapidly, its growth boosted by post-war immigration to Australia, primarily from southern Europe and the Mediterranean. While the Paris end of Collins Street began Melbourne's boutique shopping and open-air cafe cultures, the city centre was seen by many as stale, the dreary domain of office workers, something expressed by John Brack in his famous painting Collins Street. 5 p.m. Height limits in the Melbourne CBD were lifted in 1958, after the construction of ICI House, transforming the city's skyline with the introduction of skyscrapers. Suburban expansion then intensified, serviced by new indoor malls beginning with Chadstone Shopping Centre. The post-war period also saw a major renewal of the CBD and St Kilda Road, which significantly modernised the city. New fire regulations and redevelopment saw most of the taller pre-war CBD buildings either demolished or partially retained through a policy of facadism. Many of the larger suburban mansions from the boom era were also either demolished or subdivided, to counter the trend towards low-density suburban residential growth. The government began a series of controversial public housing projects in the inner city by the Housing Commission of Victoria, which resulted in demolition of many neighbourhoods and a proliferation of high-rise towers. In later years, with the rapid rise of motor vehicle ownership, the investment in freeway and highway developments greatly accelerated the outward suburban sprawl and declining inner-city population. The Bolt government sought to rapidly accelerate the modernisation of Melbourne. Major road projects including the remodelling of St Kilda Junction, the widening of Hoddle Street and then the extensive 1969 Melbourne Transportation Plan changed the face of the city into a car-dominated environment. Australia's financial and mining booms between 1969 and 1970 resulted in establishment of the headquarters of many major companies in the city. Nauru's then booming economy resulted in several ambitious investments in Melbourne, such as Nauru House. Melbourne remained Australia's main business and financial centre until the late 1970s, when it began to lose this primacy to Sydney. As the centre of Australia's Rust Belt, Melbourne experienced an economic downturn between 1989 to 1992, following the collapse of several local financial institutions. In 1992, the newly elected Kennett government began a campaign to revive the economy with an aggressive development campaign of public works coupled with the promotion of the city as a tourist destination with a focus on major events and sports tourism. During this period, the Australian Grand Prix moved to Melbourne from Adelaide. Major projects included the construction of a new facility for the Melbourne Museum, Federation Square, the Melbourne Exhibition and Convention Centre, Crown Casino and the CityLink Tollway. Other strategies included the privatisation of some of Melbourne's services, including power and public transport. and a reduction in funding to public services such as health, education and public transport infrastructure. Contemporary Melbourne. Since the mid-1990s, Melbourne has maintained significant population and employment growth. There has been substantial international investment in the city's industries and property market. Major inner-city urban renewal has occurred in areas such as South Bank, Port Melbourne, Melbourne Docklands and more recently, South Wharf. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Melbourne sustained the highest population increase and economic growth rate of any Australian capital city in the 3 years ended June 2004. These factors have led to population growth and further suburban expansion through the 2000s. From 2006, the growth of the city extended into green wedges and beyond the city's urban growth boundary. Predictions of the city's population reaching 5 million people pushed the state government to review the growth boundary in 2008 as part of its Melbourne at 5 million strategy. In 2009, Melbourne was less affected by the late 2000s financial crisis in comparison to other Australian cities. At this time, more new jobs were created in Melbourne than any other Australian city, almost as many as the next two fastest-growing cities, Brisbane and Perth combined, and Melbourne's property market remained strong, resulting in historically high property prices and widespread rent increases.